80 days. It's all we've got to get the Ferrari ready for competition because we are sending the car over to Australia for the World Time Attack Challenge thanks to our friends at Haltech and WTAC. Now there's a lot of stuff to get done in that amount of time, including a full roll cage build, and we've still got to get all of the tuning and testing on track because we haven't even really driven the car yet. But before we get there, I've been working on getting all of the loose ends, the last 10% that takes 90% of the time, finished. So let's dive into it. Let me show you what I've gotten done. To begin, let's talk about brakes. At the start of the build, we built our own pedal box using a tilt and pedal assembly to replace the original Ferrari unit and brake booster. Once welded up and installed, we then mounted our brake reservoir and then ran hard lines to plumb the system. We integrated dry brake fittings for serviceability at each corner of the car, and today we do have a functioning brake and clutch hydraulic system that effectively stops and starts the car. What we don't have, on the other hand, are functioning brake lights, and as a World Time Attack Challenge requirement, it's our first checklist item that I want to cross off the list. Now, of course, we could trigger our brake lights with a simple mechanical switch mounted to our pedal box, but I like to take things a step further, so we're going to make this a bit more complicated. I want to trigger our brake lights with a pressure switch, kind of like this one, but specifically meant for brake fluid. Our Haltech Nexus R5 PDM and ECU combo can see these brake pressures and not only data log them so we can look back at them later, but we can also simply and effectively trigger our brake lights using the exact same wiring. Now we're a little bit limited on space in the front of the car, so I want to remote mount these sensors. So I fired up Fusion 360 and got to work designing something using some McMaster-Carr parts so that we can build it true to life. The end result is this. It's pretty simple, but it should effectively relocate the sensors from the master cylinders themselves off and down to the side in the front of the car. I then uploaded the DXF file to sendcutsend.com and adjusted options like bending surfaces and anodized coatings so that we can get the exact part that we want. But because I'm in a rush and have a deadline to meet, I ordered some simple flat cut parts, and they arrived within just a couple of days. Because I've got the equipment to do it, we can bend this one up ourselves. By using Fusion 360's McMaster-Carr plugin, we're able to order the exact parts we imported into our CAD drawing. And upon the arrival of our SendCutSend parts, we can assemble everything knowing it'll fit perfectly. The end result is a sensor relocation bracket that looks exactly like we drew, and better yet, it looks like a proper finished race car part. I used the new bracket itself as a drill template for the chassis side, and then drilled some holes and used riv nuts for captive hardware, making installation as simple as possible. I had the local hydraulic shop whip up a pair of hoses so that we can run from our master cylinders to these sensors, one for the front brakes and one for the rear. Both of my Tilton master cylinders have a secondary outlet, meaning we don't have to tee into a brake line for our sensor, and instead can connect it directly to the master cylinder itself. We could have just threaded the sensors into the cylinders, but again, they would have hit our hood duct, so the remote mount is the solution. Now forgive the state of everything else under the hood. I have yet to blast and paint anything, but the plumbing is starting to look pretty fleshed out. Our new soft lines follow the hard lines down towards the center of the car, and then route over towards our new remote-mounted sensors, of which we're waiting for the second one to arrive. There's still a lot of finish work to do up here, but I'm happy with how it's turning out. More important than the looks is the function, because we now have operable brake lights. This is the first thing we can check off the list for this episode, and we can add a new metric for data logging to the list as well. Now, while they're not a requirement to compete, since we're on the topic of lights, let's revisit our Hella Jumbo 220s that we mounted at the front of the car. They represent my alternative to pop-up headlights, and they pay tribute in some fashion to the 288 GTO. Ever since mounting the lights, I've left the black and white covers installed to match the overall look of the car, but underneath, I had the guys at All City Wraps add yellow Laminex to the lenses to change the look and give it a bit of flavor. Not only does the yellow pop against the white, it also is a bit of a tribute to GT3 class cars in World Touring Car racing. But while the chassis is wired for the headlights, I never actually bothered to wire in the headlights themselves, so I took them off and over to the workbench, got out the Deutsch connectors, and set them up so they'd integrate seamlessly into our Rywire chassis harness. The housings need to be modified so the wires can pass through, but I don't want to drill a hole big enough to pass the connector through, so we'll install the light and then attach the connector on the back side of the housing. Once plugged in, we can check this off the list too. We've got functioning headlights. Now I know some of you are thinking there's no way that those meet the minimum height requirement and therefore aren't legal. And to that I say, yeah, you're probably right, but honestly, I don't care. I think if I get pulled over, these are going to be the least of my worries. So let's officially cross headlights off the list and then turn our attention back towards data acquisition. They say you can never have too much to work from, and thus we're going to add Haltech's TCA8 thermocouple amplifier to the Ferrari 244 GTK. This module uses thermocouples, also known as exhaust gas temperature or EGT sensors, to monitor the temperature of each individual cylinder. As you might guess, to install them, we've got to modify our turbo manifold, which means it's got to come out of the car. We need to weld a receiving bung to each individual exhaust primary in order for this to work. Now, there's a lot of information on the internet about where to locate these individual thermocouples, and oftentimes they're placed as close to the cylinder head as possible. But what's more important than the distance to the cylinder head is that all of the sensors have the same distance to the cylinder head. We want to make sure that they're receiving equally useful information. Now, due to some of the twists and turns of my turbo manifold, I placed each sensor about 2 inches from the cylinder head, and I placed each bung in a place where I knew that I could weld the entire perimeter of the bung itself. I back-purged the manifold with argon gas for weld purity, and everything went according to plan until my welder decided to act up. That is to say, it decided to become a fountain. Now, if I had had the foresight to fill my water cooler with Red Bull, this would have been a welcome break from welding, but instead, this coolant getting everywhere isn't going to work. So I packed my stuff up and walked next door to Byron's shop at Lightbow and used his welder to finish up the job. The grinding and the welding did a number on the Cerakote finish, but that's fixable later down the line. For now, I'm happy with the placement of these ports, and I spent a lot of time making sure they're absolutely perfect. But I've got one trick up my sleeve that I want to show you once it's in the car, so let's get these thermocouples installed. Now, if you're wondering why we want an exhaust gas temperature sensor in each primary, the answer is that it allows us to monitor the health and efficiency of each individual cylinder, allowing us to tune each cylinder individually. O2 sensors, on the other hand, typically sample all cylinders or at least entire banks at once. And this is fine for most applications, but for a setup like this that we want to push to the limit, we want every safety measure we can get. Now, the rules for depth placement on a thermocouple are different between NA and turbo engines, and with ours, we want about 6 millimeters protruding from the inside of the primary wall. Because we can't see the tip of the thermocouples of all 4 cylinders, I made index marks on each thermocouple so that I'd place them at the right depths despite not being able to see it from the flange. The only remaining step is to route and clean up the wires, and try to make these sensors look at least a little bit better. On the other hand, we need to get the thermocouple amplifier mounted as well. It's this unit that'll take the data from those sensors and send it to our Nexus R5 ECU. Now, I spent a lot of time trying to decide where I should mount this and what kind of bracket I should make, before eventually realizing the simple solution was to use my wing upright. It was out of the way of any heat sources, and it allows for easy installation and removal of the thermocouples in the event I need to pull the turbo manifold once again. But now the manifold can go back in, and I can finally show you that trick up my sleeve. It's that I spent a painstaking amount of time making sure the thermocouples would be completely invisible from the top side of the car. Sure, if you look from the correct angles, you'll catch a glimpse of them, but in all, I'm so pleased with the way this installation turned out. I took the braided thermocouple wiring, routed it down the chassis, and then plugged it into the TCA8, so we can call this just about done. But there is one last problem. My tuner Andrew was quick to tell me that these plugs can vibrate out of place. There's nothing to physically hold them into the thermocouple amplifier, and that can pose a problem with high vibration cars. Now, thankfully, every single dimension on the TCA8 is a perfectly round number, which makes drawing it up in CAD as easy as pie. And so I did just that. And then I measured up the K-style plug and drew that into place as well so I knew what I was working with, and then I designed a retention bracket to hold everything into place. Now there is some variation between thermocouple plugs, so I decided to give the retention bracket slotted holes at the top side so we'd have some adjustability. I made sure that the bracket would clear the wiring coming out of the thermocouple plug, and then I added holes not only for aesthetics, but so that we could zip tie each individual wire so no stress could be applied to the plug itself. I sent this little bracket off to Send Cut Send, and a few days later, we had it show up as well. Now there's no question that this is the overkill solution in contrast to something like some zip ties that Andrew suggested, but if you've got the skills and the know-how, why wouldn't you go this route when it only costs $7 delivered? Now I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but this really drives home how much I love the use of Fusion 360 or any CAD software as a tool in my toolbox. It allows me to imagine creative solutions to literally any problem I can conjure, and then I can execute those solutions with ease. Now, there would be a finishing touch for this bracket, and that's if I had it anodized black to match the thermocouple module, and Send Cut Send offers that as a service too. I just didn't get it in time for this episode because I am rushing to get this done. But that means that guys like you and me can make fully finished, real deal race car level parts. Stuff that looks like it came out of a catalog just by clicking your mouse. It's one of the best tool sets I have. And so if you want to make cool parts just like this one, head to sendcutsend.com/StanceWorks, enter your email, and you can get a 15% off discount code off of whatever you want to order. You could build a whole car out of it. So thank you to Send Cut Send for sponsoring this channel, for sponsoring this build. Without them, this car would not be finished. It wouldn't be going to Australia. And in turn, thank you guys for supporting one of my favorite sponsors too. And now we can cross the thermocouple installation off of the list as well. Our engine will thank us too, because now we can know exactly what's going on in each cylinder at race pace. Now let's get back to the Motorsport Australia rulebook, because there's another change we need to make if we want to be compliant with the open class rules. One of the requirements is that all fuel tanks must be vented to the exterior of the bodywork. As it stands, the original fuel tank vent sits open. It vents into the engine bay, as I have yet to do anything with it. So I decided to buy a few components to build the best vent hose assembly that we could, starting with a one-way check valve. If you look at the backside, there's an arrow that demonstrates it only flows in one direction. This will allow the fuel cell to pull air in as it pumps fuel out, preventing a vacuum inside of the tank itself. And at the same time, it will prevent fuel and fumes from venting out of the vent port and into the atmosphere. Now I'm building this vent hose out of PTFE AN line just like everything else we've done, but I'm capping it with this cute little hose barb. On the end of it, we're going to install a tiny air filter as a failsafe. In the off chance we somehow suck air into the fuel cell, I don't want any dirt or dust going with it. And then finally, we'll add one final failsafe to this fuel hose by way of adding several loops in line. The idea here is that if our check valve somehow sticks open, fuel is unable to slosh around up and out of the vent hose. It might be overkill, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. I routed the hose from the cell up and over the driver's side rear tire, and I have the filter mounted at the back of the car. Now, whether or not this meets the requirement of exterior of the vehicle, I'm not sure, but we have enough hose in our loops to move it around if we need to. With that, it's another requirement officially crossed off the list, prepping us for our trip to Australia. And now for another one. This time around, the rulebook states all vehicles must be equipped with both a front and a rear tow hook. And no, I'm not going to send my way through this problem, although I did think about it for a few. Instead, I found these FIA legal Sparco tow straps. However, there is one small problem. No disrespect to Sparco, but I'm not a big fan of the branding on them. Thankfully, the patches are only attached with simple black thread, so removing them should be a relatively trivial effort. Now I want to iterate again, Sparco makes great stuff and that's why I bought it. But as most of you have probably noticed at this point, there is only one brand on the outside of my car, my biggest sponsor, H&R. Now that'll change soon because I am planning on a livery for the World Time Attack Challenge, but even that will be for sponsors and sponsors only. So we'll keep them clean and tidy, the branding has come off, and now we can install them on the car. And thankfully, I was way too lazy at the time to remove the original bumper shock studs from the chassis of the car. They make a perfect reinforced mount for the tow straps, both front and rear. I think I prefer the clean, tow strapless look, but I do think this will look pretty good once it settles in. But for those that aren't a fan, rest assured it can tuck behind the rear panel, or if we want to make it go away entirely, we can simply fold it up and tuck it into the chassis. The mounting provisions up front are exactly the same. We'll reuse the original bumper shock studs. This was by far the easiest project so far. The overall look, I kinda like. I think the red pairs well with the yellow lights and the amber corner lights, and the hint of color is nice against the stark white vinyl. It's a cool race car touch, and at least I can say it's a requirement if it's going to be mounted to the car. But with that said, if we're going to be driving on the street, I want to do the same hideaway method with the front toe strap. Thankfully, it can fold up and tuck into the chassis, and I'll make a retaining clip to hold it there when not in use. Up next on our list is not a requirement for the rules, but instead a requirement for myself. In this box, we've got a set of brand new SKF Corvette race hubs. And if you're thinking, but Mike, you've already got hubs on your car, well, you're totally correct. I didn't really want to buy these, especially considering they are a painful $2,000. But it's common knowledge in the Corvette world that factory hubs will not hold up, and these are a requisite for racing. They've been on back order for ages, but they finally arrived and the timing is perfect. Just in time for the car to see some real abuse. I ordered these equipped with extended ARP studs and equipped with internal wheel speed sensors, which will be perfect for integrating traction control and ABS later down the line. The only problem is these are meant for a Corvette and therefore are 5 by 4 3/4 lug pattern. And as some of you might remember, we converted the Ferrari to 5 by 114.3 or 5 on 4.5. So apart they come, and over to Nimmo Machine they go so that Brett Walker can convert them and we can get them installed. I've got a few half-finished projects in this episode that we'll dive into further in the next one. First on the list is new seat mounts that'll bring our seat about 1.5 inches closer to the pedals. As it stands, I struggle a bit too much to press them completely. I'm also repurposing one of the original wiper assembly holes as a power isolation switch. We're required to have one inside the car and outside the car to comply with open class rules, and I think this is an awesome place to put it. It's also about as close as we're going to get to the base of the A-pillar, which is what is required. Last on the list, I've got a TPMS system that will give us both tire pressure and tire temperature at all 4 corners of the car. It's not quite on par with an infrared scanning system, but it'll still give us a lot of information about what's going on at all 4 corners underneath us. So we'll get it installed and integrated. Now, believe it or not, there's still a bunch of other stuff to cover in this episode. The biggest one being here in a little over a week, we're going to drag the Ferrari up to Sacramento to my former business partner Riley's Stairs shop, RS Motorsport, because we've got to tackle a full roll cage build. To meet the rules, we have to have minimum a 6-point roll cage with door bars, roof bars, and all that jazz. And Riley is the single best fabricator that I know, and he can build a roll cage faster than anybody else on planet Earth as far as I'm concerned. So I'm gonna enlist his help because I want this cage done right. I want it to turn out absolutely perfect, and I want no room for interpretation about some sort of DIY cage that tech inspectors don't like. Riley knows what he's doing. This is what he does for a living. Once we get the roll cage done, we should be ready to head out on track, plus or minus a few small things like alignment and spring rates. But before we go out on track and before we get up to Sacramento, there are other things that we've got to tackle. I'm going to try to get them all done within the next week or week and a half. The big one is I want to get sway bars on the car, or at least a front sway bar. I'm working on a pretty trick setup. For those of you that know my interest in DTM cars and what have you, I'm working much like an E30 M3 has, on an internally controlled adjustable sway bar system. So levers inside the cockpit that allow you to adjust the stiffness of the sway bar from inside the car. Don't know if it's legal for racing. If I have to remove the levers during racing, that's fine. I don't care. It's going to be sick. I'm so stoked to show you all of the thought process, how we're going to pull it off, and hopefully get it done inside of a week. We've also got power switches we've got to put on the car, isolation switches, so one on the outside, one on the inside. We've got to wire all of that stuff in, and a lot of other details. The next episode or two are going to be very intensive on fabrication. We've got a lot of stuff to tackle. With that said, make sure you subscribe if you haven't. Your support means a ton to me, and I don't want you to miss what's coming up because everything from here on out is going to be Pretty sick. Anyways, enough rambling. I'll catch you guys next week. Thanks as always for the support. I'll see you then.